Welcome to part 2 of Nothing is Easy.
It was just a war. I didn't have a preference. The 96th Division that I trained with went to the Pacific. And we're
continually moving in closer toward Okinawa Shima. Directly overhead, squadrons of dive bombers, our dive bombers, fly towards the island of Okinawa to meet the Japs. We can see the yellow smoke of the gunfire above the battleships. We are passing transports over our starboard and over our port as we plow ahead, headed for the beach and headed for the Jap.
invaded several beaches there. One of the main battles they got into was at Okinawa. And they lost an awful lot of people there. So if I'd have stayed with that unit, I probably would have gone to the Pacific. But when I went to the 78th Division, which trained at Camp Pickett, Virginia, then I was put with an advance party to the 78th Division. It was 12 officers and 12 enlisted men in the advance party that went overseas on the Aquitania out of New York City.
One midnight during the summer of 1944, I left Fort Slocum, New York, for a ship of British registry called the Aquitania. On board were 10,000 other persons, most of whom were GIs like myself. Other personnel consisted of military nurses, Women's Army Corps, or WAC, personnel, and British Navy or Marine persons. Prior to boarding the ship, and while waiting in line on a dark pier, we were served coffee and donuts by the American Red Cross. Although this was comforting, it did not make carrying a 75 to 100-pound duffel bag in the rain any more comfortable. With thoughts of possibly never returning on our minds, the silence of the night was deafening.
What were the conditions like on the ship? Were you able to move around or?
Well, there was 10,000 guys on that ship, and there were some Women Army Corps. The WAC was on there too. The night we landed in Glasgow, she was in a WAC that was on board. Actually, we got into that Glasgow about maybe 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was a really pretty sunset. And they had a concert by the British Broadcasting Company on there. It was a nice concert, and this. I was just standing on the deck looking at the sunset, but this WAC came along. I don't know who she was, and I visited with her for a couple hours. And she gave me her name and address, but I never followed through. I don't know who she was. But it was kind of a nice diversion.
Yeah, nice romantic evening.
She was going to be a secretary to someone in England, I think, and of course she was happy to be there. She was enjoying her trip, and I wasn't too happy about where I was going. So that's just the way it was, you know.
Very good. Save it for the officers.
And a lot of Army nurses. So it was a crowded ship.
Once on board, I was stowed amidship on sea deck on a rack or a bunk, which was second down from the ceiling.
Was there still the U-boat scare when you were going over?
Oh yes, yeah. I went on the Aquitania. We left New York.
There was about 2 feet between me and the guy above me. I felt very lucky because sea deck was above the waterline, and I was to sleep near an exit stairway. There were 2 GIs stowed below me, with 2 feet between rows of racks. It was a cozy situation.
And we were followed by a dirigible.
I have no idea of the time the ship left port. However, when I awoke, we were at sea, with a dirigible overhead.
A long ways out for 2 or 3 days.
And a Navy Coast Guard planes flying back and forth searching for enemy submarines. The scene lasted for a couple days, after which we were on our own.
And then we were also followed by the Navy who flew over us.
Shipboard routine consisted of a breakfast of toast, powdered eggs, occasional oatmeal, and very strong coffee, and a second meal of corned beef hash, or spam, and fried potatoes with coffee. Between meals, we exercised on the deck, or we spent time gambling or visiting. The British had guns on board, and target practice with a trailing target daily.
To check to see if there were any submarines
Right.
in the area. And we went through the northern unit way up north to get back to Glasgow. So it was quite a long trip. We were on the water for about 10 days. We were fed twice a day. In the morning we got, I don't know, scrambled eggs or something like that with bacon and something. And at night usually it was a hash of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And just 2 meals a day, and mostly coffee to drink, because they didn't have milk or anything to keep good at that time. The weather was quite calm. We didn't have a rough sea. The only rough sea that we had was when we went from Southampton to France, to Normandy, and that was the sea was rough on that time.
I think I also read something about if you were traveling on those ships, everybody was praying for fog or bad weather.
Well, yeah, and of course that was just to try and
deter
get around the submarines and stuff.
After a 10-day cruise, we sailed into the beautiful port of Glasgow, Scotland. It was late afternoon or early evening, and the ship's radio was tuned to a London Symphony concert. While on deck enjoying the music, I was visited by a nice-looking whack who seemed interested in my military job and family I'd left in Michigan. She was assigned to a post in London and anxious to get to her job. I felt somewhat different as I was headed for combat on the continent.
I arrived in Glasgow, Scotland.
Oh, in Scotland. Okay.
Yeah. And then I went by train directly from Glasgow down to Southampton through London. Of course, London was all bombed out at that time.
It was the next morning before we left the ship and boarded a train for London. The trip to London was delightful. However, upon arriving in London, we were faced with massive destruction and caskets of many dead soldiers at the station, awaiting delivery to areas in Britain and the U.S. Our stay in London was brief, as we left on another train for Southampton, where we were to ship to France.
The railroad station, there was hardly anybody there.
It's kind of a ghost town almost.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
At that time, were they firing the V1 or V2 rockets?
No, they hadn't started that at that time yet. But this was after the big air war between Germany and Britain. And of course, Germany did a lot of damage too.
Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button and stay tuned for the continuing series.